The room was immaculate, the soft scent of lavender wafting through the air. Clara, a 62-year-old woman, moved carefully, adjusting every detail for the family dinner she had planned for weeks. She selected the white linen tablecloth, an heirloom from her mother, and set it on the table with an almost ritualistic care. Every plate, every piece of cutlery was lined up precisely, as if perfection could guarantee the evening's harmony. In the hallway mirror, she adjusted her dark blue dress, the one her son Daniel had always praised as a child. "You look like a queen, Mom," he would say, with a smile that warmed her heart. Now, years later, Clara still clung to those memories, hoping to rekindle that bond. She picked up an old family photo taken at a summer picnic and smiled as she remembered the laughter of Daniel and her granddaughter Sophie. Anticipation enveloped her like a warm embrace, but also brought a twinge of anxiety. What if something went wrong? What if Daniel arrived once again with that distant coldness? Clara pushed the thought away, focusing on hope. Dinner would be perfect. She would do anything to make it so. Clara spent the morning at the market choosing the best ingredients: ripe tomatoes, fresh basil, a cut of meat Daniel loved. Each choice was an act of love, an attempt to rescue her son who seemed increasingly distant. Back in the kitchen, she chopped onions with precision, ignoring the tears streaming down her face, tears that weren't just coming from the vegetable. While the sauce simmered, Clara thought about the past. She remembered the nights she'd read stories to Daniel, the promises he'd made to never leave her alone. "You're my best friend, Mum," he'd say, hugging her tightly. But now, married to Laura, he seemed different. Laura had never looked at her with affection, always with a forced smile that hid disdain. Clara tried not to judge. Maybe it was just an impression. Maybe dinner could change everything. She set aside her apron and checked her watch. Only a few hours left. Her heart was beating fast, a mixture of hope and fear. "It'll work out," she murmured to herself, like a mantra. The table, the food, the dress, everything was ready. All that was missing was the family. As she arranged the napkins, Clara mentally revisited every detail of the dinner. She wanted everything to be perfect, not just for the food, but for what the evening represented, a chance to reconnect. In recent years, Daniel had become a stranger. Conversations were short, meetings rare. Clara sometimes blamed herself, thinking that perhaps she hadn't been a good enough mother. But then she remembered everything she'd sacrificed: the sleepless nights, the extra shifts at work, the money saved to pay for Daniel's college education. All for him. Her granddaughter, Sophie, was the only ray of light, always affectionate, always curious about her grandmother's stories. Clara smiled, imagining Sophie running to hug her. She picked up her phone to confirm the time with Daniel, but hesitated. He didn't like being controlled. Still, she needed to know if they would come. Uncertainty gnawed at her, but Clara refused to give in to pessimism. "They will come," she told herself, smoothing a lock of grey hair. The doorbell would ring soon. She was ready, or so she believed. Clara lit the candles on the table, their soft glow creating shadows that danced across the walls. She wanted the night to be special, a moment to rekindle the love she felt was fading. Deep down, she knew Daniel had changed since their wedding. Laura seemed to have built a wall between them, but Clara didn't want to believe it was intentional. Maybe it was just adulthood, the responsibilities, the time that steals everything. She picked up a pearl necklace, a gift from her late husband, and carefully put it on. "You were always strong, Clara," he said. Those words echoed now, giving her courage. She imagined the scene, Daniel walking in, smiling, maybe even apologizing for the distance. Sophie would run into his arms talking about school. Even Laura perhaps might open up a little. Clara looked at the perfect table and felt her chest tighten. This was more than dinner. It was her last attempt to save her family. The clock marked the appointed time. She waited, the silence of the house amplifying her anxiety. "They're on their way," she thought, trying to convince herself. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the clock in the living room. Clara sat on the sofa, her dress impeccable, her hands folded in her lap. Every minute that passed without the doorbell ringing increased her uneasiness. She tried to distract herself, rearranging the silverware, arranging the flowers in the center of the table. Everything was perfect, but the absence of her family was a void growing inside her. Clara picked up her cell phone again, tempted to call Daniel, but decided to wait a little longer. They might be in traffic, she thought, even though she knew Daniel's house was only 20 minutes away. She remembered a Christmas years ago when Daniel had surprised her with a handmade drawing. "You are the best mother in the world," he had written. That memory made her smile, but also brought a sharp pain. Where was that boy now? Clara stared at the door, longing to hear the doorbell. The anticipation, which had once been hope, was beginning to transform into something heavier. Still, she waited, believing that the love she had given her family could not have been in vain. Clara still stared at the door, the silence of the house weighing like a sentence. The table, with its impeccable tablecloth and flickering candles, seemed to mock her hope. The clock read 20 minutes past the agreed time, and the anxiety that had been a thin thread before was now suffocating her. She picked up her phone, her fingers hesitating over Daniel's name on the screen. Maybe I should call, she thought, but before she could dial, a notification vibrated. It was a message from Daniel. Clara's heart raced, expecting an apology for being late, perhaps an apology. But when she opened the message, the world seemed to collapse. "Mom, we're not going to dinner. Laura doesn't think it's a good idea for you to come here. I'm sorry." The words cut like a knife, cold and impersonal, sent by someone she barely recognized. Clara reread the message in disbelief, as if the letters could change. Laura thinks so? And Daniel, her son, simply agreed. Pain enveloped her, a mixture of shock and humiliation. She dropped her phone to her lap, her eyes fixed on nothing as the candles continued to burn, oblivious to her anguish. The silence in the house now seemed to scream. Clara froze on the sofa, Daniel's message echoing in her mind like a betrayal. Each word was a blow. "Laura doesn't think it's a good idea for you to come here." How could Laura, a stranger who had entered the family only a few years ago, decide who was welcome? And Daniel, her boy, the one she had raised alone after her husband's death, now exclude her with a cold message? Clara felt her chest tighten, her breath short, as if her breath had been stolen. She looked at the table, the untouched dishes, the dinner she had prepared with so much love, now a symbol of rejection. Hot tears streamed down her face, but she wiped them away quickly, refusing to give in completely. "I don't deserve this," she murmured, her voice shaking with anger and pain. She picked up her phone again, as if rereading the message could explain why, but there was no explanation, only the rawness of those words. Clara felt something shatter inside her, a trust she had held for years. Daniel's betrayal wasn't just a lack of dinner, it was abandonment. Clara rose from the sofa, her legs trembling, and walked to the kitchen. The aroma of the sauce she had cooked with such care now seemed suffocating. She turned off the stove with a brusque gesture, as if she could extinguish the pain with the fire. Daniel's message still burned in her mind, each word an implicit accusation. Laura thinks. And Daniel? What did he think? Why didn't he defend her? Clara leaned against the sink, her heart racing as memories flooded her. She had seen Daniel as a child, laughing in her arms, promising he would always protect her. Now those promises seemed like lies. She thought of Laura, with her cold gaze and forced smiles, always so quick to judge. Clara had never said anything, for fear of alienating her son, but now she saw that her tolerance had only made her vulnerable. Humiliation grew, mixed with an anger she had never felt before. How dare they, she thought, her fists clenched. The message wasn't just a rejection, was a declaration that she had no place in their lives. Clara took a deep breath, trying to contain the storm within her. Sitting at the table, Clara stared at the empty plates, her cell phone beside her like an enemy. Daniel's message was an open wound, and each time she reread it, the pain intensified. "Sorry," he had written, but the word sounded empty, devoid of remorse. Clara tried to imagine what had led to this. Did Laura see her as a threat? Or was it Daniel who, out of convenience, decided to push her away? She remembered the times she had noticed the distance, the declined invitations, the unreturned calls. She had always justified it, thinking it was the stress of work, marriage, life. But now the truth was undeniable. She had been excluded. The pain gave way to a growing indignation. Clara had dedicated her life to her son, sacrificed her dreams, saved every penny to ensure he had everything. And now a text message dismissed her as if it were nothing. She picked up the family photo from the shelf, looking at Daniel's smile. "Who are you now?" she asked aloud, her voice thick with hurt. The betrayal was more than personal. It was a denial of everything she stood for. Clara blew out the candles one by one, the gesture slow and deliberate, as if closing a chapter. Daniel's message still throbbed in her mind, but now the pain began to mingle with a cold clarity. She was no longer the naive mother who believed unconditional love would be enough. She sat back down, cell phone in hand, and reread the message one last time before tossing it on the table. The humiliation still burned, but something new was being born within her, a determination she hadn't felt in years. Clara thought of Laura, her veiled arrogance, the subtle comments that always belittled her. She thought of Daniel, who had chosen his wife over the mother who raised him. The rejection was a blow, but also an awakening. "Do they think they can erase me like that?" she murmured, her eyes shining with a mixture of tears and anger. The house, once a stage of hope, was now the scene of a betrayal Clara would not forget. She stood, her heart heavy, but her mind already beginning to form a plan. That message wouldn't be the end. It would be the beginning of something bigger. Clara walked slowly down the hallway, the echoes of Daniel's message still reverberating in her mind. The pain of rejection had driven her to a forgotten corner of the house, a small desk where she kept papers and memories. With trembling hands, she opened a drawer and found an old financial notebook. Leafing through the yellowed pages, she saw records of transfers, checks, deposits, all for Daniel. The money that had paid for college, the car, even the down payment on the house where he lived with Laura. Each number was proof of her sacrifice, but now it felt like a burden. Clara sat, the notebook open in front of her, and realized the stark truth. She had given everything, and in return she received a cold message. Memories of Daniel as a child, laughing in her arms, now mingled with the bitterness of her indifference. "I did everything for him," she murmured, her voice thick with indignation. But then a sharp question arose. Had all that money been an attempt to buy love? The thought made her shiver. For the first time, Clara saw that her generosity might have been her prison. The realization hurt, but it also ignited a spark of clarity. Sitting at her desk, Clara continued to review the papers, each receipt a knife to her heart. There were records of loans that had never been repaid, expensive gifts for Laura, even Sophie's school fees that Clara had insisted on covering. She remembered every moment she had given up something of herself to ensure Daniel's family had everything. But where was the gratitude? Where was the love she thought she was building? Daniel's message, with its cutting coldness, seemed to laugh at her efforts. Clara slammed the notebook shut, the sound echoing in the silent house. She looked around, seeing pictures of better times, and felt anger rise. It wasn't just the rejection, it was the ingratitude, the way Daniel and Laura had treated her like a resource, not a mother. One specific memory surfaced. Laura, with a fake smile, telling Clara, "No need to worry so much." Now those words felt like manipulation. Clara took a deep breath, her mind beginning to sort through the fragments of her pain. She wasn't just a victim, was someone who could change the game. Moonlight streamed through the window, illuminating Clara's face as she opened another drawer. This time she found old letters from Daniel, written in his teens, filled with promises of eternal love. "You are my hero, Mom," he had written in one. Clara held the letter, the tears returning, but now mixed with a cold determination. She realized that for years she had clung to those words, using them to justify every sacrifice. But the reality was clear. Daniel was no longer that boy. He had chosen Laura, chosen convenience, and had cast Clara aside. She picked up a recent bank statement and saw the automatic transfers she still made to his account. Every penny was a chain, binding her to an illusion. "Enough," she whispered, her voice steady for the first time in hours. The discovery of her own complicity in the family dynamic was painful, but also liberating. Clara was not just a rejected mother. She was a woman who had given power to others for too long. The idea of reclaiming that power began to take shape in her mind. Clara got up from her desk, notebook still in hand, and walked into the living room. The dinner table, with its untouched dishes, seemed like a monument to her mistake. She realized that for years she had tried to fill the emotional void with money, believing it would keep the family together. But Daniel's message proved otherwise. Laura had never respected her, and Daniel, influenced or not, had chosen to align himself with her. Clara opened a cabinet and found more documents. The power of attorney she had given Daniel to manage part of her assets, the financial support contracts. Each paper was a reminder of how she had put herself in the background. Anger now mingled with an almost surgical clarity. She was not just a victim of ingratitude, she was someone who, without realizing it, had allowed herself to be used. The discovery brought a mixture of shame and strength. Clara looked at her phone, still with Daniel's message on the screen, and felt something shift. It was no longer just pain. It was the beginning of an internal rebellion, a desire to regain control. Standing in the middle of the room, Clara held the documents as if they were evidence of a crime. Each receipt, each transfer, told the story of a woman who had given everything and received little in return. Daniel's rejection wasn't just a message, it was the culmination of years of indifference disguised as love. Clara thought of Sophie, the granddaughter who still looked at her fondly and wondered if she knew of her parents' decision. But that didn't matter now. The most painful realization was that Clara had spent her life trying to buy Daniel's loyalty, and he had thrown it away with a text message. She walked to the window, looking at the dark sky, and felt a determination grow. "They think I'm weak," she thought, her inner voice stronger now. The pain was still there, but now there was purpose. Clara would no longer be the mother who begged for love. She was a woman who could decide her own worth. With the papers in hand, she knew the next step would be to act, not for revenge yet, but for justice for herself. Clara held the documents tightly, her fingers clenched over the pages detailing years of financial support for Daniel. The dim light in the room reflected in her eyes, now shining with a resolve she hadn't felt in decades. Daniel's message, with its cutting coldness, was no longer just a wound, it was a catalyst. She walked to her desk, picked up a pen, and began listing all the automatic transfers she still made. Daniel's allowance, the household bills, even Laura's car insurance. Each item crossed off was a weight lifted from her shoulders. "Enough of being used," she murmured, her voice firm, though her heart still ached. Clara knew that suspending the payments would only be the beginning. The power of attorney she had given Daniel, giving him control over part of her assets, was a mistake that needed to be corrected. She picked up her cell phone and looked up her lawyer's number, hesitating for a moment. What if Daniel regretted it? What if it was just a misunderstanding? But the memory of the message, "Laura doesn't think it's a good idea," made her grit her teeth. There was no more room for doubt. Clara made the decision. It was time to regain control. Sitting at the living room table, Clara opened her laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating her determined face. She accessed the bank app, the familiar interface now resembling a battlefield. With a few clicks, she suspended all automatic transfers to Daniel's account. Each confirmation was an act of liberation, but also a reminder of betrayal. She thought of Laura with her false smile, and of Daniel, who had chosen his wife over his mother. Anger drove her, but there was also a cold clarity. Clara didn't just want to punish, she wanted to protect herself. She found the power of attorney document in the house safe, the paper signed years ago, when she trusted her son blindly. Never again, she thought, tearing up a symbolic copy. Calling the lawyer would be the next step, but it was too late. Clara decided that the next morning she would schedule an appointment to revoke the power of attorney and review her will. The idea of severing financial ties frightened her, but also empowered her. For the first time in years, she was acting for herself, not Daniel. The weight of the decision was enormous, but Clara felt an unexpected relief. The silence in the house now seemed less oppressive. Clara walked to the kitchen, where the untouched dinner still sat, and began putting away the food with methodical gestures. Each plate she put away was a metaphor for her decision. She was cleaning up the mess she had allowed for too long. Daniel's message still resonated, but now Clara saw beyond the pain. She was no longer just the rejected mother. She was a woman who could rewrite her story. She sat back down, opened a new notebook, and began writing a plan. First, the bank, then the lawyer. Next, a conversation with Sophie, the granddaughter who might be the only one who understood. Clara knew her actions would have consequences. Daniel would be furious, Laura would be indignant, but that didn't stop her. She imagined the moment her son would realize the money was no longer coming. The image brought a pang of guilt, quickly drowned out by the memory of her ingratitude. Clara closed the notebook, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She wasn't just cutting financial ties, was cutting the chains that bound her. Standing in the living room, Clara stared at the family photo on the bookshelf. Daniel, Laura, Sophie, all smiling in a moment that now felt like a lie. She decided she would no longer allow herself to be manipulated by guilt or the hope of a love that didn't exist. The decision to suspend payments and revoke the power of attorney was more than a response to Daniel's message. It was a declaration of independence. Clara picked up her phone and texted the lawyer, scheduling a meeting for the next day. "I need to protect my assets," she typed, each word reinforcing her resolve. She thought of Sophie, the granddaughter who still loved her, and resolved that any remaining money would be kept for her. but protected. The thought of Daniel facing the consequences of his choice brought a bitter satisfaction. Clara knew the confrontation was inevitable, but she was ready. She was no longer the mother who begged for attention. She was a woman who demanded respect. The decision was made, and the path ahead, though uncertain, finally felt like hers. Clara put the documents away on her desk, each movement charged with purpose. She imagined Daniel receiving the notice from the bank, the shock on his face, his attempt to explain to Laura why the money had stopped. The image was almost pleasurable, but Clara didn't want to lose herself in revenge. Her decision was about self-preservation, about regaining the dignity that had been stolen from her. She glanced at the clock, almost midnight. The house was quiet, but Clara felt a new energy coursing through her veins. For the first time in years, she wasn't waiting for Daniel, wasn't planning how to please him. The decision to sever financial and legal ties was a risk, but also a liberation. Clara thought about the future, about how she could use her money for herself, perhaps traveling, perhaps resuming hobbies she'd abandoned. The idea made her smile, a shy but genuine smile. She didn't know how Daniel would react, but that no longer mattered. His message had been the end of an era. Her decision was the beginning of another. Clara turned out the living room lights, ready for the next step. Clara woke to the sun flooding her room, a light that felt different, brighter, as if reflecting the change within her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the weight of pleasing Daniel or waiting for his approval. The decision to cut financial ties had left her feeling light, as if she had released an anchor. She got up, put on a comfortable blouse, and instead of rushing to her cell phone, walked to the balcony with a cup of coffee. The fresh air caressed her face, and Clara took a deep breath, feeling the freedom to think about herself. For years, her life had revolved around Daniel, his needs, her family. Now, she could choose. She walked to the closet and pulled out a notebook of old notes, where she had dreamed of trips and painting classes she had never taken. The thought of resuming those dreams brought warmth to her chest. Clara smiled, imagining herself in a studio, brush in hand, creating something just for herself. Daniel's message still stung, but now it was a distant echo. She was no longer the mother defined by her son. It was Clara, a woman ready to live. In the kitchen, Clara prepared a simple breakfast, but with a care she hadn't shown herself in a long time. She cut fresh fruit, toasting the bread calmly, as if each gesture were a celebration of her independence. Sitting at the table, she opened her laptop and began researching travel destinations. Italy, perhaps, with its hills and museums, or a small town where she could stroll leisurely. The idea of spending her money on herself, not on Daniel or Laura, was revolutionary. Clara thought about the revoked power of attorney, the cancelled transfers, and felt a growing pride. She wasn't just freeing herself from financial obligations, she was freeing herself from a role that suffocated her. For years, she had feared that saying no would push Daniel away forever, but now she saw that the separation had already happened by his choice. The pain of rejection was still there, but Clara transformed it into strength. She picked up a pen and wrote, "I deserve this." The phrase, so simple, was a declaration of self-worth. For the first time, Clara felt like her future belonged to her. Back in the living room, Clara rearranged the photos on the shelf, placing those of Daniel and Laura at the back, almost hidden. In their place, she brought an old photo of herself, a young woman smiling on a beach with her husband. That dreamy Clara had seemed so distant, but now she felt that energy returning. She decided to call a longtime friend, Maria, whom she hadn't spoken to in months, always busy with Daniel's demands. The conversation flowed, full of laughter and plans. Maria suggested a local cooking class, something Clara had always wanted to do. "Why not?" she replied, surprised by her own boldness. The freedom of saying yes to herself was intoxicating. She thought of Sophie, her granddaughter, and decided she would stay in touch with her, but without the pressure of pleasing her parents. Clara no longer needed to buy love. She could give it freely, without chains. Daniel's message, which had once destroyed her, was now just a milestone. Clara was building a new life, one where she was the protagonist. While organizing the house, Clara found an old diary, forgotten in a box. Flipping through the pages, she saw entries from years ago, filled with worries about Daniel, with to-do lists for him. She closed the diary and decided it was time for a new one. She took out a blank notebook and wrote on the first page, "My life, my choices." Each word was a step away from the woman who sacrificed everything for others. Clara thought about the dinner that never happened, the dishes she'd saved, and realized she no longer needed Daniel's approval to feel complete. She opened her closet and chose a vibrant outfit, something she'd never worn for fear of looking too much. He put it on, looked in the mirror, and liked what he saw. The freedom wasn't just financial, it was emotional, spiritual. Clara knew Daniel and Laura would feel the impact of her decisions, but that no longer defined her. She was free, not to punish them, but to live. The weight of the past was being lifted, and the future seemed, for the first time, a place of possibility. Late in the afternoon, Clara walked to the garden, something she rarely did. She sat on a bench, observing the flowers she had planted years ago, now full and vibrant. She realized that, like those flowers, she too could bloom even after years of neglect. The decision to sever financial ties with Daniel had been the first step, but true liberation lay in rediscovering who she was. Clara thought of the lawyer, of the meeting scheduled for the next day, and felt a resolute calm. She would protect her assets, but more importantly, she would protect herself. Daniel's message had wounded her deeply, but it had also awakened her. Clara was no longer the mother begging for a place in her son's life. She was a woman choosing her own path. As the sun set, she closed her eyes, letting the breeze caress her face. For the first time in a long time, Clara felt peace. It wasn't the end of her pain, but the beginning of a life where she was enough, and that she knew was the greatest act of courage she could commit. Clara was in the garden, still soaking in the peace of the previous day, when she heard the sound of a bicycle approaching. She looked up and saw Sophie, her 14-year-old granddaughter, dismounting with a shy smile. Clara's heart leaped. Sophie was the only connection to Daniel that still felt genuine. "Grandma, can I come in?" the girl asked hesitantly, holding the bicycle. Clara ran to hug her, feeling the warmth of an affection that needed no conditions. They sat on the garden bench, and Sophie, with her eyes downcast, confessed that she had heard about the cancelled dinner. "I didn't know, Grandma. Mom said you didn't want to come, but I didn't believe her." The words were a balm for Clara, but also a confirmation of Laura's manipulation. She held Sophie's hands, noticing how worried, almost guilty, the girl looked. "It's not your fault, dear," Clara said, her voice soft but firm. The reunion rekindled hope, not in Daniel, but in a bond that could still be saved. Sophie smiled, and Clara felt that, for the first time, she wasn't alone in her grief. Inside the house, Clara made Sophie tea while she talked about school and her friends. Each word was a window into the life Clara feared she was missing. Sophie mentioned, almost unintentionally, that Daniel and Laura had been arguing a lot about money lately. Dad said things were going to be hard, but he didn't explain why, she confessed, her face furrowed. Clara felt a pang of guilt, knowing her financial decisions might be affecting Sophie. But then the girl added, "I just want you to be okay, Grandma. You're always so good to me." Sophie's sincerity disarmed Clara, who realized her granddaughter didn't see her as a resource, but as family. They laughed together, reminiscing about picnics and game nights. Clara felt the weight of Daniel's message lift a little, replaced by the warmth of Sophie's presence. Sophie wasn't aware of her complete rejection, but her loyalty was clear. Clara decided she would protect this bond, but not use it to get closer to Daniel. Sophie was enough on her own. As they walked through the yard, Sophie took Clara's hand, a gesture so natural it brought tears to her grandmother's eyes. The girl asked about the flowers, and Clara told stories of planting them with her husband years ago. Sophie listened attentively, her eyes shining, and asked, "Grandma, why don't you come home anymore? I miss you." The question hit Clara like a blow, but she chose the truth carefully. "Sometimes people make decisions that drive us apart, dear, but you and I, we will always have our time." Sophie nodded, as if she understood more than her words conveyed. Clara could tell her granddaughter sensed the tension between her parents and her, but chose to stay by her side. That moment, so simple, was a revelation. Clara didn't need Daniel to have a family. Sophie was her connection to pure, unconditional love. They sat down again, and Clara promised herself she would keep Sophie in her life, but without the chains of the past. The reunion was an unexpected gift, a light in the midst of the storm. Clara showed Sophie an old photo album, and the two spent the afternoon laughing over old images. There was a photo of a baby Sophie in Clara's arms, with Daniel smiling in the background. The memory brought a mix of nostalgia and pain, but Sophie interrupted her. "Grandma, you've always been my favorite person. Don't let them hurt you, okay?" The girl's maturity surprised Clara, who felt a surge of pride and protectiveness. Sophie didn't know the details of Daniel's message, but she seemed to sense the injustice. Clara decided she wouldn't involve her granddaughter in the conflicts with her parents, but she wouldn't hide her strength either. "I'm fine, dear, and now I'm going to be even better," she replied, with a smile that blended determination and tenderness. Sophie hugged her tightly, and Clara felt their bond was unbreakable. Her granddaughter's presence was proof that not all was lost. Clara knew the confrontation with Daniel was coming, but with Sophie by her side, even if only in spirit, she felt stronger. The reunion rekindled her courage. As Sophie said goodbye, promising to return soon, Clara stood on the porch, watching the bicycle disappear around the corner. The visit had been a reminder that true love doesn't require one-sided sacrifices. Sophie, with her sincerity, had shown Clara that she still had value, not as a provider, but as a grandmother, a person. Clara returned inside, her heart lighter but her mind focused. Sophie's presence reinforced her resolve to move forward, to protect her independence. She thought about the meeting with the lawyer, scheduled for the next day, and felt a resolute calm. Daniel and Laura could have rejected her, but Sophie had chosen to stay. This contrast was a lesson. Clara didn't need to beg for love. She deserved someone who offered it freely. Her granddaughter, unknowingly, had given Clara the strength to face what was to come. As she put away the album, Clara smiled, knowing that this reunion wasn't just a moment, but a milestone. She was ready for the next step, with Sophie as her anchor of hope. Clara sat on the sofa, the photo album still beside her, Sophie's words echoing in her mind. Her granddaughter's visit had brought relief, but it had also forced her to face a truth she had avoided for years. She picked up her phone and reread Daniel's message, each word now a reminder of her own blindness. For decades, Clara had believed that her unconditional love, expressed in money and sacrifice, would keep the family together. But Daniel's rejection was proof that she had tried to buy something that could not be bought. "I was wrong," she murmured, her voice filled with raw pain, but also clarity. She thought of all the times she had ignored the signs, the short conversations, Laura's glances, Daniel's growing coldness. Every check, every transfer, had been an attempt to hold on to a love that had already slipped away. The truth was brutal. She had been used, unloved. Clara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of this revelation. But instead of collapsing, she felt strength surge. Facing the truth was not defeat. It was the first step to freeing herself from an illusion that held her captive. Standing in the living room, Clara walked to the desk where she kept her financial documents. Each paper was evidence of her delusion, proof of how she had put herself on the back burner. She reviewed the notes from years of supporting Daniel, the college, the house, the trips he and Laura had taken while she saved. The truth hit her like a wave. She wasn't just a generous mother. She was a victim of her own need to be loved. Clara thought of Laura, always with subtle comments that belittled her, and of Daniel, who had never defended her. "I let this happen," he admitted, his voice shaking with anger and regret. But the guilt didn't overwhelm her. Instead, it fueled her resolve. Facing the truth meant acknowledging that she deserved more respect, more dignity, more self-love. Clara picked up an old photo of herself, smiling with her husband, and felt a connection with this woman who knew how to dream. The truth hurt, but it also freed her. She no longer needed to beg for a place in Daniel's life. She could create it for herself. Clara opened a window, letting fresh air flood the room. The breeze seemed to carry away the remnants of her naivete. She thought of Sophie, of her granddaughter's sincerity, and realized that true love didn't require one-sided sacrifices. Daniel, on the other hand, had chosen Laura's convenience over loyalty to his mother. The truth was, Clara had spent years trying to fill a void that wasn't hers to fill. Every gift, every check, was an offering she made in the hope of being seen, of being valued. But Daniel saw her as a resource, not a mother. The realization was painful but also empowering. Clara wasn't to blame for his coldness. She was the victim of a dynamic she had allowed for too long. She sat back down, picking up a notebook where she wrote, "I am enough." The words simple were a revolution. Facing the truth meant accepting that she couldn't change Daniel, but she could change herself. And that change was already underway. As she put away the documents, Clara felt a clarity she hadn't experienced in years. Daniel's message wasn't just a rejection, it was a mirror that showed how she'd allowed herself to be erased. For years, she'd believed her role as a mother was to sacrifice everything, but now she saw that this had rendered her invisible to Daniel, to Laura, even to herself. The truth was that love couldn't be bought. and the guilt she felt for not being enough was a lie she'd fed herself. Clara looked at her phone, tempted to reply to Daniel's message, but decided silence was more powerful. He didn't deserve an explanation. She deserved peace. She thought of Sophie, of the promise to maintain that bond, and knew her granddaughter's love was genuine, not tied to money. The truth, though painful, was liberating. Clara didn't need Daniel's approval to be whole. She closed the notebook, her heart lighter but her mind sharp. The meeting with the lawyer scheduled for the next day would be the next step in sealing her independence. Clara walked to the hallway mirror, staring at her reflection. The woman she saw was no longer the mother desperate for approval, but someone beginning to recognize herself. Facing the truth about Daniel and Laura had been like tearing away a veil. She had seen the manipulation, the ingratitude, and above all, her own complicity in allowing it. "I gave too much of myself," she whispered, not with regret, but with acceptance. The truth was, she couldn't change the past, but she could shape the future. She thought of the times she had remained silent in the face of Laura's comments, the times she had justified Daniel's distance. All of that was over now. Clara knew the confrontation with her son was inevitable, but she didn't fear it. Facing the truth had made her stronger, not weaker. She picked up the pearl necklace her husband had given her, feeling his strength in his words. "You are enough, Clara." For the first time, she believed it. The truth wasn't the end, it was the beginning of her redemption, and she was ready to live it. Clara woke with a determination that seemed to pulse through her veins. The truth she had faced the night before had transformed her, and now it was time to act. She put on a navy blazer, adjusted her pearl necklace, and grabbed the folder containing the financial documents she had gathered. At the bank, she sat across from the manager, her voice firm as she explained that she wanted to cancel all automatic transfers to Daniel's account. The manager, surprised, confirmed each transaction with a click, and Clara felt an almost physical relief as she watched the numbers disappear from the screen. Then she requested a review of all authorizations linked to her son, including the power of attorney granting her access to his assets. "I want everything in my name," he said, his tone thick with authority. The manager nodded, and Clara realized that each step was a reclaiming of her autonomy. She thought about Daniel, about how he would react when he realized the money flow had dried up, but the image didn't shake her. For once, Clara was protecting herself, not him. As she left the bank, the sun seemed brighter, and she knew the next step would be even more decisive. In the lawyer's office, Clara sat with a posture she hadn't displayed in years. The folder of documents lay open in front of her, each paper a testament to her former generosity and current betrayal. She explained the situation clearly: Daniel's message, Laura's manipulation, the need to protect her assets. The lawyer, a middle-aged man with wire-framed glasses, listened attentively as Clara detailed the revocation of the power of attorney. "I want to ensure that no one else has control over what's mine," he said, his voice firm but with a slight tremor of emotion. The lawyer suggested creating a trust for Sophie, protected from Daniel and Laura, and Clara immediately agreed. The idea of securing her granddaughter's future without fueling her parents' greed was perfect. She also requested a revision of her will, removing Daniel as the primary beneficiary. The decision was painful but necessary. Clara imagined Daniel's shock, but the thought brought no guilt, only justice. As she signed the initial papers, she felt a weight lift. It was the beginning of a new era. Back home, Clara organized the signed documents, each one a brick in the wall she was building around herself. The meeting with the lawyer had solidified her decision. She would no longer be the mother who gave everything without question. She thought of Sophie, of her promise to protect her, and felt a warmth in her chest. The trust fund would ensure her granddaughter had opportunities, but without interference from Daniel or Laura. Clara had also cancelled Daniel's access to a joint account she had maintained for years, a gesture that seemed small but was monumental. Each action was an affirmation of her worth. She glanced at her phone, expecting an angry call from Daniel, but the silence pleased her. He didn't yet know the impact, but he would soon find out. Clara imagined Laura with her arrogant smile, facing the reality that the money was gone. The image brought a cold satisfaction, but Clara didn't give in to revenge. This was about protection, not punishment. She stored the documents in a safe, feeling safer than ever. Her financial life was now hers, and hers alone. Clara spent the afternoon reviewing her personal finances, something she rarely did, always prioritizing Daniel's needs. She discovered that without the monthly transfers, she could live more comfortably. perhaps even fulfill the dreams she had abandoned. The idea of traveling, painting, living for herself seemed less distant now. She jotted down her next steps, transferring her investments to protected accounts, increasing her emergency savings, planning a trip. Each decision was an act of rebellion against the role she had played for so long. Clara thought of Daniel's message, of Laura's coldness, and felt her anger transform into power. They had seen her as a source of resources, but now she was a fortress. The legal and financial change wasn't just a protection against ingratitude, it was a declaration of independence. Clara looked at Sophie's photo on the bookshelf, smiling. Her granddaughter's future was secure, and hers for the first time too. She closed her notebook, her heart light, but her mind sharp for what was to come. Sitting at the living room table, Clara reviewed the lawyer's papers once more. Each signature was a broken chain, a step away from the woman who had sacrificed herself for a love she didn't receive. She thought of Daniel, how he would react when he realized the power of attorney had been revoked, that the money would no longer be coming. The image of him, perhaps furious, perhaps pleading, didn't shake her. Instead, it strengthened her resolve. Clara had known the confrontation was coming, but now she was prepared. The legal and financial change was more than a barrier against manipulation. It was proof that she could rise above the pain. She thought of Sophie, of the trust fund that would protect her, and felt a deep peace. Her granddaughter's love was genuine, and Clara would ensure it wouldn't be tainted by her parents' greed. As she put the documents away, she looked out the window, the orange late afternoon sky reflecting her new strength. Clara was no longer the victim of Daniel's message. She was the architect of her own life, and that life now belonged to her. Clara was in the living room, organizing the lawyer's documents when the doorbell rang, cutting through the silence like a blade. She knew who it was before she even opened the door. Daniel was there, his face flushed with anger, his eyes flashing with a mixture of despair and indignation. "Why did you do this, Mom?" he snapped without greeting, holding up his cell phone with the bank notification. Clara stared at him, her heart racing but her voice firm. "Come in, Daniel, we need to talk." He hesitated but entered, throwing himself onto the sofa with a theatrical sigh. Clara remained standing, her posture erect, her pearl necklace shining like armor. "You cut me off, Mom. How am I going to pay the bills? Laura is furious," he said, his voice loud, almost accusatory. Clara felt the old guilt try to surface, but she drowned it out with the memory of his cold message. "You rejected me, Daniel. You said I wasn't welcome." "That has consequences," he replied, each word a precise blow. His face changed, shock replacing anger. Clara saw for the first time her son realized she was no longer the submissive mother he knew. Sitting down, Daniel tried to change his tone, softening his voice. "Mum, it was a misunderstanding. Laura just wanted to avoid discomfort." Clara almost laughed at the hypocrisy. She took out her phone and showed him his message, the cruel words flashing on the screen. "Is this a misunderstanding, Daniel? Or is this you choosing your wife over your mother?" He looked away, unresponsive. Clara continued, her voice firm but heavy with years of suppressed pain. "I gave everything for you. I paid for your college, your house, even Laura's car. And you discard me with a message?" Daniel opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Clara felt strength building within her. For the first time, it wasn't her begging for love. It was him facing the consequences. "You and Laura used me, Daniel, but that ends now." He stood, his face pale, trying to argue. "You can't do this, Mom. We're family." Clara interrupted him coldly. "Family doesn't reject. Family doesn't manipulate." The silence that followed was heavy, but Clara felt unshakable, like a rock against the storm. Daniel walked to the window, hands in his pockets, avoiding Clara's gaze. "You don't understand, Mom. Laura just wanted to protect our family," he said, his voice weak, almost pleading. Clara felt a pang of pity but didn't give in. She walked to the table where the lawyer's documents were organized and pointed at them. "Protect the family, or protect the money you expected me to keep giving?" Daniel turned, his face contorted with anger and shame. "That's unfair," he exclaimed, but Clara saw the truth in his eyes. He knew she was right. She took a deep breath, keeping her calm. "It was unfair to exclude me from the dinner I prepared with so much love. It was unfair to treat me like a bank, not like a mother." Daniel fell silent, the weight of his actions finally catching up with him. Clara felt the power of the truth in his words. She didn't need to shout. Her strength lay in her clarity. "I revoked the power of attorney, Daniel, and I changed the will. Sophie will get what she deserves, but you and Laura, you'll have to fend for yourselves." The confrontation reached a climax when Daniel, desperate, tried to appeal to her emotions. "Mom, I love you. You know that. Just give me another chance." Clara heard the words she had dreamed of hearing for years, but now they sounded hollow. She thought of Sophie, of her granddaughter's sincerity, and compared them to Daniel's manipulation. "Love isn't like that, Daniel. Love doesn't reject, doesn't use, doesn't discard," she said, her voice firm but with a deep sadness. He lowered his head, without argument. Clara felt her heart tighten, but also a liberation. Confronting him wasn't just about exposing hypocrisy, it was about affirming her own worth. "You made your choices. Now, I make mine," she continued, pointing to the door. Daniel stared at her, his eyes moist, but Clara didn't waver. She was no longer the mother who gave in to guilt. The confrontation was painful, but necessary. Daniel left without another word, and Clara closed the door, the sound echoing like the end of an era. She was free, not only from him, but from her own expectations. Clara stood still in the living room, the silence now an ally, not a burden. The confrontation with Daniel had shaken her, but it had also strengthened her. She walked to the bookshelf, picking up Sophie's photo, and smiled. Her granddaughter was a reminder that not all was lost, but Daniel had chosen his path. Clara thought about his words, his desperate tone, and realized he wasn't remorseful. He was afraid of the consequences. Laura's manipulation, the coldness of his message, it all made sense now. Clara was no longer the victim of her actions. She was the author of her own story. She put away the lawyer's documents, knowing her financial and legal decisions were unshakable. The confrontation with Daniel hadn't just been an argument, it had been a declaration of independence. Clara looked out the window, seeing the street where Daniel had disappeared. The pain was still there, but now there was pride. She had faced her son, exposed the truth and emerged stronger. The next chapter of her life would be about her, not him, and that, Clara knew, was the true victory. Clara closed the door behind Daniel, the sound of the latch echoing like a full stop. She walked into the living room, her heart still racing from the confrontation, but an unexpected calm was beginning to settle in. She sat on the sofa, the pearl necklace still around her neck, a reminder of the strength her husband had always seen in her. For the first time in years, Clara felt no weight of guilt or the need to please. The confrontation with Daniel had been painful, but also liberating. She was no longer the mother defined by her son's approval. She was a woman who had chosen herself. She looked at the table where dinner had never happened, and instead of sadness, she felt relief. Daniel's cruel message, Laura's manipulation, all of it had led her to this moment. Clara took out a notebook and wrote, "Today, I started over." The words were simple but powerful, a vow to herself. She thought of Sophie, of the trust fund that would protect her granddaughter, and smiled. The pain of the past still lingered, but now there was room for something new, a future where Clara was the priority. For the first time, she felt truly free. The next morning, Clara woke with an energy she didn't recognize. She put on light, colorful clothing and decided to walk to the nearby park. The sun warmed her skin, and each step felt like an act of renewal. In the park, she watched children playing, couples laughing, and realized that life went on with or without Daniel. She sat on a bench, opened a book she had bought months before but never read, and immersed herself in the pages. Reading, something so simple, was a rebellion against the years she had spent living for others. Clara thought about the trust fund for Sophie, the changes to the will, and felt proud. She had not only protected her assets, she had protected her dignity. The memory of Daniel's message still stung, but now it was a reminder of her strength, not her weakness. Clara closed the book, looked up at the sky, and took a deep breath. Emotional freedom was a gift she had given herself. For the first time in decades, Clara wasn't waiting for anyone. She was living, and that was enough. Back home, Clara began planning her next adventure. She opened her laptop and researched painting classes, something she had abandoned in her youth to prioritize family. She found a local studio offering weekly classes and signed up without hesitation. The thought of holding a paintbrush again made her smile, a smile that came from within, not from an attempt to please. She also booked a trip to Italy, a long-held dream she had always put off because of Daniel. Now the money she had saved for years would be used for her. Clara thought of her confrontation with Daniel, the desperation on his face, and felt a calm satisfaction. It wasn't revenge, it was justice. He and Laura would face the consequences of their choices, but Clara didn't need to dwell on that. She picked up an old photo of herself, smiling with her husband, and placed it in a new frame. "You were right, love, I am enough," she whispered. Clara's emotional rebirth wasn't just about letting go of the past. It was about embracing who she had always been. Clara spent the afternoon reorganizing the house, but this time with a different purpose. She put away Daniel and Laura's photos in a box, not out of anger, but because they no longer defined her space. In their place, she put drawings Sophie had given her and a blank canvas, ready for her painting lessons. Each change in the house mirrored the change within her. Clara was no longer the mother who begged for love. She was a woman who found it within herself. She thought of Sophie, of the promise of maintaining that bond, and decided to invite her to spend a weekend together, away from Daniel and Laura's influence. Her granddaughter was her connection to genuine love, and Clara would protect it carefully. Daniel's message, which had once destroyed her, was now just a footnote in her story. Clara opened the window, letting in the fresh air, and felt a profound peace. She didn't need anyone's approval to be whole. Rebirth was real, and each day would be a chance to live it fully. That evening, Clara sat on the porch, a glass of wine in hand, watching the stars. The house, once a stage of anticipation and pain, was now a haven of possibilities. She thought of Daniel, of how he and Laura were coping with their new reality, but the thought didn't consume her. They would make their choices, just as she had made hers. Clara toasted herself, a silent gesture of victory. The emotional rebirth wasn't just about overcoming rejection. It was about rediscovering her own strength, her own voice. She imagined Italy, the vibrant colors of her future paintings, the laughter with Sophie. Life, which had for so long felt like a sacrifice, was now a blank canvas, ready to be filled. Clara smiled, her heart light, her mind clear. Daniel's message had been the end of an era, but also the beginning of something much greater. She was free, empowered, and above all, complete. Under the stars, Clara knew the next chapter would be the most beautiful of her life.